The winter came early that year. Frost clung to the battlements like white moss, creeping down the stones as though nature itself meant to reclaim the castle. Inside, the fire roared endlessly, but the warmth never reached the old king's bones. He lay upon a bed of carved oak and crimson silk, once the envy of foreign courts, now a prison of velvet. His crown, that cold circlet of gold and iron, sat upon a table nearby, dull beneath the candlelight. He had worn it for 40 years, and now it seemed to mock him with its stillness, as if it waited impatiently for another head to claim. The court moved quietly these days. Pages whispered instead of spoke, and the sound of footsteps echoed like guilt. Physicians came and went with bowls of broth and pouches of herbs, promising strength they could not give. Outside the door, guards stood with the stoicism of statues, but even they could not hide their unease. They knew that when the old lion finally stopped breathing, the kingdom would shake. Everyone knew. Even the wind seemed to carry the rumor beyond the walls, to the villages, to the taverns, to the monasteries where monks already prayed for his soul. The king's breath rasped like parchment tearing. He could no longer ride, no longer hold a sword, no longer summon the booming voice that once silenced a room. Yet his mind wandered, sharp and merciless. He remembered campaigns across frozen rivers, the scent of blood and mud after victory, the weight of a slain enemy's crown in his hands. But what haunted him most was not conquest. It was the silence that followed it. Every victory had left a scar, and every scar whispered of the price paid by those who had no say in his wars. He had once believed he ruled by divine right. Now, in the cold light of dying, he began to wonder whether that divinity had ever been real. Outside, the bells of vespers rang. The sound drifted through the castle corridors, reminding everyone that while a king may rule a kingdom, time rules all. A servant entered, trembling, to stoke the fire and adjust his furs. The king watched him silently. The boy's hands shook as he worked, terrified to meet his gaze. In that moment the king saw the truth of his reign, the distance between ruler and ruled, the fear mistaken for respect. He wanted to speak, to say something human, but the words caught like dry leaves in his throat. He coughed instead, and blood stained the cloth pressed to his lips. The servant fled, whispering a prayer under his breath. At night, when the torches burned low, the king would stare at the ceiling beams and imagine the faces of those who had died for his throne. Some he could name. Others had become shadows in his dreams. His late queen appeared most often, a pale vision of forgiveness he did not deserve. Once, he reached out to her illusion and felt only the cold air of his empty chamber. "Forgive me," he murmured, though for what he could no longer say. Perhaps for everything. Perhaps for being king at all. His chamberlain entered with a ledger, asking about decrees that still required his seal, taxes, land grants, judgments, affairs of state that no longer mattered to a dying man. Yet the king insisted on reading each line. His trembling hand scrawled the royal signature across parchment after parchment. He would not be remembered as a ruler who lost control. When the chamberlain bowed and withdrew, the king stared at the ink drying before him. His name, once the weight of authority, now looked like the ghost of a word fading into dust. As dawn broke, he asked to see his crown. They brought it to him upon a silk cushion. He lifted it with effort, the metal heavy in his frail hands. Once it had felt like destiny. Now it felt like judgment. He ran his fingers over the engraved cross, the tiny jewels, the dents from battles long forgotten. And then, for the first time in years, he wept. Not from pain, but from the realization that everything he had built, conquered and commanded, would outlive him by only a breath before being claimed by another. The crown did not belong to him. It never had. It belonged to time. He placed it gently upon his chest and closed his eyes. The fire hissed. The walls groaned. Outside, the snow fell in quiet sheets, burying the footprints of those who had walked before him. The king, once a master of all he surveyed, lay small beneath the weight of his own creation. The crown gleamed faintly, as if it too grieved for him, or perhaps rejoiced. The smell of burning resin filled the great hall, mingling with the cold scent of damp stone. Courtiers moved like ghosts among the pillars, their silk shoes silent against the floor. Every glance carried calculation, every whisper carried risk. The king's illness had turned the royal court into a battlefield fought with smiles instead of swords. Behind jeweled collars and polite laughter, ambition sharpened its claws. It was said that when a monarch begins to die, so too does loyalty. And within these walls, both were decaying by the hour. The queen's brother, a man of cunning wit and colder eyes, lingered near the council table, pretending to study a map. His lands had long suffered under royal taxes, and the thought of a new reign tempted him like wine to a drunkard. Across the room, the archbishop murmured to two young nobles, his tone honeyed but dangerous. The church had plans of its own. The crown owed it debts in both gold and favor, and the next ruler would determine whether those debts would be forgiven or multiplied. At the far end of the chamber, a handful of knights drank quietly. They had fought for the king in his youth, bled for him, lost brothers for him. Yet even they spoke cautiously now. Their armor no longer gleamed, their loyalty no longer inspired awe. They knew that when the old king's breath stopped, their oaths might die with him. The heir, whoever he would be, might not need the loyalty of men from another age. "It's the waiting that kills you," one muttered, tracing a scar across his cheek. The others nodded. They had faced arrows, fire, famine, but nothing was as deadly as silence. The king's steward, a nervous man with ink-stained hands, tried to keep order. He delivered messages, organized meals, managed petitions that would never be answered. Each day, fewer came to court. Some claimed illness, others left quietly before dawn, taking their chances with whichever lord rose next. The steward felt the weight of it, how quickly devotion melted into survival. Once, the castle had echoed with music and laughter. Now even the minstrels played softer, as if afraid to disturb death itself. Meanwhile, rumors slithered through the corridors like serpents. Some said the king had already died, that the body in the royal bed was a ruse to delay the inevitable. Others swore the physician was poisoning him at the bishop's command. Servants whispered that they'd seen shadows moving behind the curtains at night, or heard the ghost of the late queen weeping near the chapel. In truth, it was not ghosts that haunted the palace. It was greed, wrapped in silk and prayer. By torchlight, secret meetings bloomed. The chamberlain met the treasurer in the wine cellar. A page carried letters sealed with unfamiliar crests, and somewhere in the darkness, the spy master listened. Every faction wanted to know the same thing: who would inherit the throne? The king had no clear successor, his eldest son dead, his second vanished in rebellion years before. Only a sickly grandson remained, barely of age and already a puppet for hungrier men. The court was no longer a council of the crown, it was a marketplace for the future. Beyond the castle gates, the townsfolk could feel the tension. Prices rose, guards grew harsher, and the air smelled of unrest. Merchants delayed deliveries, priests warned of divine wrath, and soldiers stationed in the outer walls whispered about desertion. They did not need to see the king to know the truth. When power weakens, rot spreads fast. The realm was holding its breath, and every man and woman could feel the storm building in their bones. And above it all, in his chamber high above the murmurs, the king lay half awake. He heard their footsteps, their secrets, their ambition bleeding through the walls. He could almost taste it. It was not the poison in his cup that sickened him most. It was the betrayal that filled the air like smoke. He had ruled with iron and fear, and now fear ruled them all. The king turned his head towards the window, watching snow drift through the moonlight, and whispered a single truth to the empty room. They're already dividing me. The king no longer dreamed of battlefields. His sleep, when it came, was full of faces, soldiers, peasants, beggars, and children, all staring at him with the quiet accusation of the dead. In the fevered glow of the hearth, he sometimes spoke to them. His attendants, trembling in the shadows, heard him beg for names they didn't know. "Forgive me, Tommel. Forgive me, my son." They'd hear before the coughing fit began again. When dawn broke, he remembered none of it, or pretended not to. But guilt has a longer memory than kings. The priest came often now, clutching his rosary like a weapon. He spoke of redemption, of confession, of cleansing the soul before the final judgment. The king listened with one ear and stared at the crucifix above his bed. There was a time when he'd believed heaven had chosen him, that his crown was proof of divine favor. Now he wasn't so sure. He had seen too much blood spilled in God's name. Priests blessing the swords of men who would burn villages by nightfall, bishops counting coins earned from the sale of absolution. The church had told him he was God's chosen hand. But if that was true, why did his hand still tremble? When the priest asked if he repented, the king smiled faintly. "Repentance," he rasped, "is for men who had choices." The priest flinched but said nothing. For years, this man had watched him order deaths with the flick of a finger, seen fields turned to graves at his command. Yet now, standing over his failing body, even the priest felt pity. The crown had not made the king a monster. It had made him a man who could never again be innocent. Later that day, the physician entered with his usual concoction, a mixture of wine, honey, and crushed poppy. The king drank and drifted into the haze between waking and dream. He found himself again on the field of Ethelmar, where his army had crushed the rebellion of his own nobles. He remembered the banners burning, the screams of the wounded, the stench of iron and fear. That day had secured his throne. That day had also cost 10,000 lives. He'd told himself it was necessary, that mercy was weakness. Now, as he watched phantom soldiers march through the fog of his memory, he wondered if power itself was the true rebellion, a rebellion against the soul. When he awoke, the priest was gone, replaced by the soft murmur of his nurse reading from a psalter. Her voice, steady and warm, broke the silence that clung to the room. "All flesh is grass," she read, "and all the glory of man as the flower of grass. The grass withereth, and the flower falleth away." The king turned his head slightly, his eyes glistening. "Then what remains?" he asked. The nurse hesitated. "Only God, my lord." The king's lips twitched into a sad smile. "And yet?" He never answers. That night, he demanded parchment and ink. With shaking hands, he began writing letters, not to nobles or clergy, but to the dead, to his queen, whom he had married for alliance, not love, to his eldest son, whom he'd disowned for rebellion, to the general he'd executed for cowardice, though the man had only begged him to spare the wounded. His script faltered with every line, words blurring through his tears. He knew no one would ever read them. It was not confession he sought, but acknowledgement. The simple, mortal act of saying, I remember." As he finished, his candle flickered and went out, plunging the chamber into near darkness. The cold crept into his bones like the whisper of judgment. Somewhere in the distance, he heard bells, not for Mass, not for Vespers, but for a funeral. He wondered whose. Perhaps a noble who had died of gluttony. Perhaps a farmer crushed beneath winter's weight. Or perhaps, he thought, they ring for me already. He lay back and stared at the canopy above him, seeing not wood and silk, but the shifting faces of all he had ruled. The priest's words returned: confess, repent, cleanse. But how does one wash away a kingdom's sins? He exhaled a trembling breath, one part prayer, one part despair. If God is King of heaven, he murmured to the empty room, then he must know what it is to be alone. The king's chamber had become a battlefield of belief. On one side stood the priest, draped in black and gold, his lips constantly murmuring prayers for the salvation of the king's soul. On the other, the royal physician, stooped, weary, reeking of rosemary and vinegar, fought to keep the dying body alive. Between them lay the king himself, the unwilling prize in their war between heaven and earth. "His pulse weakens by the hour," said the physician, pressing his fingers against the monarch's cold wrist. "He needs warmth, food, bloodletting perhaps." Bloodletting. The priest's voice snapped through the silence like a whip. "You've taken more of his blood than the devil himself." The physician turned, anger flickering in his eyes. "And you've filled his mind with fear enough to kill a healthy man." The king watched them bicker through half-shut eyes. The two men had served him faithfully for decades, one for his body, the other for his soul, yet now they looked like vultures, circling a carcass neither could claim. The physician believed in balance, humors, bile, air, and fire. He trusted in reason, herbs, and the quiet hand of a healer. The priest believed in the unseen, in sin and salvation, in the war for a soul teetering on the edge of eternity. Both were certain they were right, and both feared failure. For if the king died unshriven, the priest's faith would be questioned. If he died under the physician's care, the doctor's name would be cursed from pulpit to tavern. Thus every breath the king took was a judgment upon them both. That evening, the physician prepared a draught of valerian, poppy, and wine. "It will ease his pain," he murmured. "Perhaps let him rest." But the priest stepped forward, his shadow falling across the goblet. He must face his maker with a clear mind. The physician's patience cracked. "And if he suffers until his mind breaks, will your God grant mercy to madness?" The priest's reply came soft, deadly. "Better madness than damnation." They stared at one another for a long moment, the last two men in a kingdom still pretending control over death. Finally, the king rasped, "Give it to me." The physician obeyed, the priest whispering Latin benedictions over the cup, as if to purify its contents. When the bitter liquid touched his tongue, the king felt warmth spread through his chest, fleeting, false, but welcome. His breath slowed, his mind dulled. The fire crackled softly, and in the half-light, the two men resumed their vigil. The priest prayed, clutching the crucifix as if to drag the king's soul heavenward by force. The physician wrote notes by candlelight, hands trembling as he tracked a pulse that flickered like a dying flame. Hours passed. The snow outside thickened into silence. The physician finally dozed in his chair, exhaustion claiming him. The priest, however, remained awake, watching the king's face as though waiting for a sign, a twitch of the lips, a final breath, a vision. And in that silence, he began to speak softly, not to the king, but to himself. "What is mercy?" he whispered, "to one who ruled without it?" His eyes glistened and his voice trembled. And what is faith, when even kings fear God's justice? The physician stirred, awoken by the priest's murmur. "He'll last the night," he said, though he didn't believe it. The priest gave no reply. He was staring at the crucifix on the wall, the figure of Christ bent in eternal suffering. It struck him then, with cruel irony, that kings and saviors die in similar poses, powerless, surrounded by those who can neither save nor understand them. By dawn, the king opened his eyes. His voice was barely a whisper. "Tell me," he said, "which of you has the harder burden, to heal the dying or to save the damned?" Neither man answered. The question lingered in the smoky air long after he drifted back into sleep, a riddle neither medicine nor faith could solve. For in that dim, flickering chamber, both men realized the same truth. The body could be mended or broken, the soul redeemed or lost. But the weight of a crown was a sickness no cure could touch. The world beyond the castle walls no longer obeyed the rhythms of peace. Winter had struck hard that year, and the roads were little more than veins of ice cutting through a frozen corpse of a kingdom. Villages starved beneath snowdrifts, fields lay buried, and in the taverns, whispers replaced prayers. When kings grow weak, so too does order. The peasants didn't need a herald to tell them their monarch was dying. They felt it in the air, like wolves scenting blood. In the marketplace of the capital, merchants argued over rumors as if they were currency. One claimed the king had been dead for a fortnight. Another swore he'd risen again by miracle. But all agreed on one thing. The realm stood on the edge of something terrible. Grain stores had dwindled, taxes had grown, and the lords who once protected their lands now hoarded their silver, waiting to see which banner would rise over the citadel when the crown fell. Inside the court, the truth was no less grim. The royal guard was restless. Their captain, an old soldier named Sir Brandrick, had seen the way men's loyalties shifted like shadows. "We guard a dying man," he muttered to his lieutenant, "and a kingdom already half dead." He had been loyal his entire life, but he could feel it now. The tremor before collapse, the silence before revolt. The garrison's pay was late, the treasury empty. A soldier fights for faith, but he stays for coin. Letters began arriving, sealed with unfamiliar crests. Some carried offers of alliance, others threats cloaked in courtesy. The queen's brother, the ambitious duke who haunted the corridors like a vulture, had begun secret correspondence with neighboring lords. He spoke of stability, of continuity, of the preservation of the realm. But beneath his elegant phrases lay a single poisonous truth. He meant to rule when the crown fell. The people in the city began to gather in corners, muttering names, old royal lines, forgotten heirs, and folk legends of kings who would return when the land grew dark. At night, bonfires flickered in defiance, and guards extinguished them with force. Those who protested vanished into dungeons that grew colder by the day. The bishop preached obedience from the pulpit, his voice trembling more than thunderous. Even faith could feel the kingdom cracking. One night, while snow battered the castle windows, the chamberlain rushed into the royal bedroom. His breath steamed in the air. "Your Grace," he stammered, "there are riots near the southern gate. The people demand food and—" "Let them eat their prayers," croaked the king. His voice was softer now, thin as parchment. "I fed them with peace for 40 years. Let them chew on memory." The physician urged him to rest, but the king refused. He asked instead for his sword, the one that had won him the throne. They brought it, its blade dulled and tarnished with age. He held it across his chest, staring into the steel. In its reflection, he saw not the warrior he had been, but the ruin he had become. "The kingdom was never mine," he whispered. It was only borrowed, from the living and the dead alike. Outside, the rebellion grew teeth. Peasants armed with pitchforks and stolen blades stormed the tax offices. Smoke rose over the outer walls. Bells rang from every tower, not for worship, but for warning. The Queen's brother gathered soldiers in the courtyard, shouting orders that sounded dangerously close to a coronation speech. In the chaos, no one noticed the priest kneeling alone in the chapel, praying not for victory, but for mercy. As dawn broke, the horizon glowed with more than sunlight. It burned. The king could smell it even through the stone walls. Fire, smoke, and fear. He turned to the window and murmured to the empty room, "A king is not buried when he dies. He is buried when his people forget to kneel." The words hung there, heavy as prophecy, and for the first time in all his reign, he understood that power wasn't lost through battle, but through hunger, of the body, of the soul, of a nation starved too long on promises. The castle gates groaned open on a morning of ice and smoke. From the mist rode the air, pale, solemn, and younger than the kingdom's memory of its last triumph. His horses' hooves echoed through the courtyard like a funeral march. He had been summoned weeks before, but the storms had delayed him, and rumor had already declared him dead 3 times on the road. Now, as he dismounted beneath the gaze of weary guards and trembling servants, all eyes searched for something divine or decisive in him, some reflection of the dying king's shadow. They found none. The prince, though some whispered he was barely that, had been raised far from court, under the care of tutors and distant lords. He had studied the histories of his ancestors, learned to write poetry in Latin, and to pray in the manner of the devout. But he had never commanded men, nor walked among the hungry, nor smelled the rot of war. Now, stepping into the great hall lined with banners older than he was, he looked less like a savior and more like a boy pretending at destiny. The Queen's brother greeted him first, bowing just low enough to show courtesy without submission. "My lord," he said smoothly, "your father's strength wanes, but the realm still looks to you." His smile was soft as silk, his words sharp as a blade. The prince nodded, unsure whether to thank or fear him. Around them, courtiers shifted their allegiances in their minds, adjusting their expressions like masks at a masquerade. The scent of power, new, fragile, and unclaimed, filled the air. When at last the heir was led to the royal chamber, the physician warned him in hushed tones, "He knows the world beyond this bed only through pain now. Speak gently." The door opened with a sigh, and the prince entered. The sight before him silenced even the practiced lines he had rehearsed. His father, the king, the man who had once stood taller than fear itself, lay shrunken beneath the furs, his breath rattling like a dying bellows. The crown rested on the table beside him, catching the faint light of the window. It looked heavier than the man who had worn it. The king stirred when he heard footsteps. His eyes fluttered open, clouded but still sharp enough to pierce through illusion. "So," he rasped, "the vulture sent word to the lamb." The prince froze, unsure if the insult was meant for him or another. "Father," he began softly, "I came as soon as I—" "Too late," the old man interrupted. "You've come too late for the kingdom, and too early for your throne." He coughed, and blood stained the pillow. The priest moved forward, but the king waved him off with a trembling hand. "Not yet," he whispered, "not yet." For a long moment, neither spoke. The prince studied his father, searching for some trace of warmth, some acknowledgement of love. He found only exhaustion, the weary contempt of a ruler who saw himself reflected in a weaker form. "Do you fear me, boy?" the king asked finally. The prince swallowed hard. "I fear what you became," he said. The words hung like frost in the air. To everyone's shock, the king laughed, a ragged, painful sound. Then perhaps there's hope for you. Outside, the court already buzzed with speculation. Some said the old man would name his son that very night. Others claimed he would damn him with silence. The bishop drafted oaths for succession, while the queen's brother whispered to the guards in private. The realm balanced on a knife's edge. Inside the dim chamber, the king beckoned his son closer. "They wait for my breath to stop," he murmured, "as vultures wait for carrion. Remember this, when they call you majesty, they kneel not for you, but for the power you carry. Lose that, and they will tear you apart." He reached for the crown, his frail hand trembling as it brushed against the cold metal. "It will not fit you yet," he whispered, "but it will crush you all the same." The prince bowed his head, unsure whether he had been blessed or cursed. And as he left the chamber, the torches along the hall seemed to burn lower, their flames bending toward him like supplicants or warnings. Behind the closed door, the king's cough echoed once more, followed by silence so deep it felt like the first crack in an empire. The night came heavy and windless, as if the world itself had paused to witness the end of a reign. Inside the castle, torches burned low, their light trembling across the stone like breath upon glass. The air smelled of tallow, incense, and decay. The king had not moved in hours. He lay propped upon his pillows, staring toward the ceiling beams darkened by years of smoke, listening to the slow tick of his own faltering heart. Around him, the room seemed to close in, each shadow a memory, each whisper from the corridor a farewell. The priest sat by the bedside, his rosary clutched so tightly the beads left marks in his hand. The physician, hollow-eyed and sleepless, hovered nearby, pretending to take the pulse of a man whose blood had already begun to retreat. No courtiers came now. Even the queen's brother, who had haunted the chamber like a phantom of ambition, had withdrawn to whisper with the guards. Death was a private matter at last. The throne, however, was already public property. "Father Alaric," the king murmured, breaking the silence, "have you ever watched the sun rise from a battlefield?" The priest shook his head, unsure whether this was confession or delirium. "It's beautiful," the king continued, "and terrible. You see everything you've destroyed, fields, men, the morning itself, and for a moment you believe you've conquered the dawn. But then the light grows, and you see the truth. You've conquered nothing. You've only survived." His lips trembled, but he smiled faintly. "And now even that's beyond me." The priest leaned closer. "There is still time, my liege, to make peace with God." "Peace?" The king laughed softly, though it sounded more like a cough. "I made peace with no man alive. Why should heaven be easier?" He turned his head toward the window. Snowflakes drifted through the crack where the shutters failed to close, melting upon his skin. "Perhaps," he said, "that is God's mercy, to let me feel something pure before I die." The priest began to recite the Confiteor, voice trembling, Latin words flowing through the chamber like a river washing blood from stone. The physician bowed his head in silence, but the king interrupted him. "Enough prayers. Tell me a lie instead." The priest hesitated. "A lie, my lord?" "Yes," the king whispered. "Tell me my people loved me. Tell me the wars were worth it. Tell me the crown meant something." The priest's eyes glistened. "If I tell you that, would you believe it?" The king's smile faded. "No, but it would be kind to hear." Hours passed, like days. The candle stubs withered into pools of wax. The physician dozed at his table, his head nodding toward the parchment where he had been recording the king's decline, as though chronicling a siege. The priest alone remained awake, watching as the monarch drifted in and out of fevered dreams. At times, the king whispered to unseen figures, his queen, his sons, perhaps even his enemies. At one point, he stretched out his trembling hand and said, "There, across the river. The banners still fly." Then his arm fell, limp and pale as parchment. As midnight deepened, the wind rose outside, carrying the faint tolling of church bells from the distant city. The king stirred. "For whom do they ring?" he asked. "For you, my lord," said the priest. "Then let them ring louder," he murmured. "Let them wake the dead, and remind them I am coming." The priest took his hand and began the rites of extreme unction. Oil touched the brow, the lips, the chest. The king's breath grew shallow, his gaze fixed on the crown that rested beside him, its gold dulled by shadow. "Take it," he whispered to no one in particular. "Take it from me before it burns another soul." His eyes fluttered once more toward the window, toward the faint glimmer of dawn far beyond the snow. "Tell them," he began, but the words failed him. His final exhale was not a sigh, but a release, like a door opening to a vast silence beyond. The priest bowed his head. The physician wept quietly, his hand still resting on the dead man's wrist as though unwilling to admit defeat. Outside, the storm broke, scattering snow across the courtyard. The torches flickered once, then steadied. The king was gone, and yet the room still hummed with his absence, as if power itself refused to believe its master had fallen. The castle bell tolled before sunrise, deep and slow, each strike rippling through the frozen air like the echo of a world ending. The city below stirred from uneasy sleep. Some crossed themselves and whispered prayers, others simply nodded, as though they had known this moment was coming all along. In the castle's courtyard, snow blanketed the ground, muting the clamor of hurried footsteps. The king was dead, and with him went an age. Inside, the chamber was already being transformed from a deathbed into a reliquary. Servants lit candles along the walls. The priest murmured psalms, his voice hoarse from weeping. The physician, pale and still, stood beside the bed as if awaiting orders from the man who could no longer give them. On the table lay the crown, gleaming faintly beneath the wavering flame, an object both sacred and accursed. No one dared touch it yet. To lift it was to assume its curse, to grasp the same weight that had bent the spine of every man who'd worn it before. The heir entered just after dawn. He looked exhausted, unshaven, his cloak stiff with frost. The courtiers who had abandoned the dying monarch now gathered at his side, eager once more to bend their knees. Yet as they bowed, there was hesitation in their movements, a flicker of fear that the boy they'd once dismissed now held their fates in his trembling hands. He approached the bed and looked down upon his father. The old king's face had softened, the lines of command fading into something almost peaceful. It was the face of a man who had finally escaped himself. The priest turned to the young man. "It is time," he said. But the prince did not answer. His gaze fell upon the crown, that gleaming relic of sin and glory. For a long moment no one breathed. Then, slowly, he reached out. The metal was cold, almost biting. As he lifted it, a few jewels clinked softly against the gold like drops of frozen rain. The courtiers murmured prayers. The priest whispered blessings. Yet to the prince, it felt less like an anointing and more like shackles closing. Outside, the people gathered before the gates. Some cried, some merely stared. A few even smiled, not from joy, but from the strange relief that always follows the end of a long reign. Soldiers lined the walls, their armor dull with frost. Bells rang again, not in mourning now, but in announcement. "The king is dead!" the herald cried, his voice cracking in the cold. "Long live the king!" The words echoed over the rooftops, dissolving into the gray sky. And so the world turned, unfeeling and unstoppable. Inside the Hall of State, preparations for the coronation began even before the old body was cold. Courtiers scurried to secure positions. Scribes drew up new oaths. The Duke, the Queen's brother, was already whispering counsel to the new sovereign. The kingdom, it seemed, had learned nothing from the death that still lingered in the air. The old order simply put on a new face. The priest saw it all and shuddered. "Nothing changes," he murmured, "only the name on the prayer." That night, the king's body was carried to the royal crypt beneath the chapel. The procession moved in silence, the corridors lit by torchlight. Snow hissed against the stained glass windows, melting into tears. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, the new king stood above it, his breath fogging the air. The crown rested upon his brow, its weight unmistakable. For a moment he reached out, not as a ruler, but as a son, and touched the wood of the casket. "I will not be like you," he whispered. But somewhere deep within, a darker voice replied, "You already are." When the tomb was sealed, the torches were extinguished one by one, until only darkness remained. The priest lingered long after the others had gone, staring at the stone slab that bore no name yet. "All kings are forgotten," he said softly, as though speaking to the dust itself. "Even those who tried to be gods." Then he turned and ascended into the night. Above the crypt, the castle slept beneath the endless snow. The realm had a new monarch, a new dawn, a new lie. Yet in the silence of that frozen morning, the wind carried a sound only the stones could hear, the faint, eternal echo of a crown being set down upon a table, and the ghost of a voice whispering, "It was never yours."